life is not so filled with skepticism. Yeah, I am a Christian. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let me double check, make sure we're live here.
No, I don't think so. That's not good with that light in the back.
Yeah, that probably turn that off.
That's good, hon. Thank you.
Okay. So Daniel, my name's
Not good with
Doug.
that light in the back.
That
Hi,
probably turn
Doug.
that off. And
Yeah.
and so you probably don't know much about me, but I have this little YouTube channel called Pine Creek, and I do two things mostly. One is I interview people like yourself about deeply held beliefs, and typically it's about religion, but not always. Sometimes it's politics, or sometimes it's GMOs or organic foods or anything like that. I've interviewed a couple flat earthers as well. That was kind of interesting.
I heard they're out there, but I've never met one.
Yeah, I don't think I've met one face to face, but I've interviewed, I think, at least two different ones, and they truly, sincerely believe that the Earth is flat.
Yeah, that's incredible. I don't know where they get that from.
So that's the first thing I do is interviews. The second thing I do is I critique apologists and pastors, and I don't know if you've seen any of those videos, but I try to pick the big names and find a sermon or a message that I think is worthy to critique, and I kind of critique it from an unbeliever's point of view, which I think is rare. Not too many people do that, at least in a civil and thoughtful way. I hope I'm not too uncivil when I do it. But I used to be a Christian for 30 years. Left Christianity starting around age 35. By 40, I called myself a deist. And now I call myself an atheist. And so if I know that word means different things to different people, atheism and atheist, but all I mean by that word is that I don't live my life like there's a God. I think if you truly believe there's a God, you should live your life differently. Now, not to say that I'm full of debauchery and chicanery or anything like that, but yeah. So that's a little bit about me. So why don't you tell me about yourself? You've been a Christian for how long?
For 41 years. I come from a Jewish background. In fact, I was an avid Zionist and lived in Israel for a couple of years, and I had no intention of ever returning. But it was in Israel that I began to search for God. But I began my search through my own traditions because I always felt intensely Jewish. I wasn't sure that there was a God, but more and more, after all other hopes of finding peace and happiness were dissolving, God was kind of like my last resort. So it was there in Israel when I really began searching for God, and I began searching among religious Jews, and I really wasn't able to grab a hold of anything that would make a difference in my
So
life.
how old were you at this point?
I was in Israel from age, let's see, 23 to 26.
Okay.
And that was back in from 1970 to just about 73.
Okay. So you're in your mid 20s, and
Yeah, right.
so was there like something major that happened in your life, or was it just a sense of you needed more in your life, or?
I can't say it was something major. Yeah, I did need something. I had experienced decades of depression. And later on, this is after Israel, panic attacks. And so they left me devastated. In fact, with the depression, even though it was severe at times, I felt like nothing could stop me. I had enough hubris, enough self-confidence to just push my way through. But after the panic attacks hit, I was devastated. But this was after that. While I was in Israel, I was looking for personal answers. And I thought for sure that I'd go to Israel and I'd find all the meaning and purpose in my purpose that I dreamed of having. I knew I needed that. I knew I needed to live for something. I wasn't sure what it was, but I had seen a number of psychologists, all highly recommended. And my boast is that each one left me worse off than I was before.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I was there in Israel. I began to seek, but I wasn't coming up with anything.
What do you think caused the anxiety attacks and depression in the first place? Did you ever figure that out?
Oh, I think there were a lot of factors. I think, for one thing, my nature is a very melancholy and anxious and type A and driven nature. So I think when you have a nature like that, you're more prone. But there were other factors too.
Okay. Okay. And so, how did you first stumble upon Jesus? I guess if you're a Christian.
Well, that wasn't easy, because that was the last stone I wanted to stumble across. Because I wrongly, but I felt that Christians were my enemies, and either they would kill me or they would try to change me, and neither did I want. so so Jesus was the last one I wanted. In fact, if I ever had an opportunity to confront Christians and to ridicule them, that was a wonderful joy of mine. And but that all changed after I came back to the States. I came back with a wife, and she's French. Yes, she's French, and she didn't want to go to France. She didn't want to stay in Israel, and so she wanted to go to the States. So we went to the States, and both of us were very radical. Uh, Both of us rejected society and the values of society and the bourgeoisie and the making it, or whatever that consisted of, and so we became part of the Back to the Land movement. Which meant that we wanted to live in harmony with nature, believing that if we did do this, we would experience the peace of nature. But of course, well, what I didn't realize is that living off nature is a very demanding thing.
So, would you have
And
considered yourself like a hippie type?
uh, if you would have seen me, you would probably have thought me a hippie, but I wasn't much of a joiner, and I didn't find anything to really identify with. I didn't connect to people very well. I was an antisocial type.
Hmm.
So I don't think you can call me a hippie. So what happened was, the farming didn't pan out. The peace of mind was beyond my reach. And so one day, when my wife was in town, and I lived about 2 hours away from the closest neighbor, I had a horrible chainsaw injury. The chainsaw bucked back and hit me in the head, and you probably can't see it right now, but I have a scar going down my head from the chainsaw. And so, in horror, I lifted my hands to my head to see if I still had a skull.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and when I lifted my hands up, I saw that this wrist was half off and was hanging, because it happened so quickly when the chainsaw bucked back. It caught my wrist too, and the blood was squirting out like a hose. And
So,
so,
how actually, can you put your mic down a little bit? We're having people say in chat that you're coming in really hot. Just lower it a bit.
how's that? Is that good?
Yeah, and so you're coming in loud and clear, what I'm hearing, but so you don't have to talk loud.
Okay, great.
But so how old were you when you had this chainsaw accident?
29 years old.
Okay, so this is after you were already a Christian.
No, no, no,
No?
no, no.
Okay.
Actually, this led the way to my becoming a Christian, because I was laying in a pool of blood. I was bleeding to death. I was losing so much blood that I thought my next breath would be my last one. And so I began to say a prayer that Jews say before they're going to die. And afterwards, suddenly, I realized I wasn't alone. I realized there was somebody else there. And I knew, don't ask me how I knew it. I don't know how I knew it. But I knew that God was there. and I knew he loved me, and I knew that he would take care of me, that somehow he'd bring me through this, and even if I died, I knew he would be there in death for me. Somehow I knew all this. And I knew that I was taken care. I was filled with such a joy. I was in ecstasy.
Now,
Nothing mattered anymore.
now, was this the Christian God you were thinking of at this time, or the
I
Jewish
didn't
God?
know.
Okay,
I
just
didn't
something.
have a clue. I just knew that God was there, and somehow he loved me. He would protect me. I was safe. Nothing mattered anymore, but that God was there, that he loved me and he would take care of me. That was all that mattered. And so I was miraculously rescued, and I was in the hospital for 4 days. And while I was there, the people who had rescued me brought me some books to read that were Christian. And so I read the books, and I was amazed. I was troubled. I was amazed to think that the God these books seemed to describe seemed like the same God I had encountered. But this idea of becoming a Christian was so foreign to me. It was like it was like somebody offering you peace of mind if you would become an elephant or a fish or something like it. It represented the rejection of my entire identity.
So, do you think you would
And
have had this thought of God there while you were bleeding to death if you wouldn't have been in Israel and raised like with a Jewish background?
no, I don't think it had anything to do with it. In fact, I was a student at the University of California in Berkeley from 65 through 68. And it was in Berkeley that I had the same experience. And it was my first year. At the end of my first year, I was in a study hall. It was finals time, and I put my head down in my arms. And when I lifted my head up, everything was different. I mean, perceptually, I saw the same things, I heard the same things, but my sense of everything was different. I didn't understand what in the world was going on, but was filled with this joy, this ecstasy, and I decided to leave my studies behind, and I just had to experience this. And I went out in the street, and I was so filled with love for other people, even myself, but so filled with love for other people that when I would see them pass me in the street, I would have to put my head down because I loved each. I started crying. I didn't understand what, and I never experienced anything like this. In fact, at the time, I was very interested in the occult. I was interested in something that would elevate me, that would heighten my self-esteem. And the occult back then kind of represented to me power, power over your life. And I felt that I didn't have this power. I didn't have this esteem. And I was interested in that. But after this experience, and the next morning was gone. There was nothing I could do to bring it back. Nothing at all. Like with the occult, there are all these rituals and formulas, and you were in charge, and you can bring back this experience whenever you. But this experience, I couldn't touch. And so I wanted to bring it back. This experience opened my eyes up that this world was far richer than I ever dreamed possible, but there was nothing I
But
could
at
do.
this time, did you come to a conclusion of what the source or the
No,
cause of
not at
this?
all.
Okay. At that
I
time, what
had
did you
no,
think
it
then?
was a total mystery to me.
Okay.
All I knew is that there is something incredibly credible out there. Is something there. But I didn't, the word God didn't even come into my thinking. And as much as I wanted this experience to come back, it didn't come back. In fact, for years I sought it, but there was nothing I could do.
But did
I was
it
helpless.
did the thought occur to you that, or how did you exclude the possibility that it was purely processes of the brain, either hormonal imbalances, sleep deprivation, or just something purely biological? Did that thought occur to you, or?
No, because the experience itself had a certain congruence to it. It was real. The things I was seeing were real. In fact, my life became more real than it ever was before. The people I saw were more real. Everything was connected. Everything had a place. And so I never even thought that there is something chemically wrong. It was all so, life was so
Well,
rich.
it sounds like it could have been chemically right. I mean, I'm sure you've heard people who have done LSD and other drugs that their perception of reality is very real and very prominent and significant, but yet I would think that that is purely what the chemicals are doing to the brain. Would you agree?
Oh, sure, I would agree, but there was a big difference here. After your drug trip is over, you recognize that, okay, you were taken other places, but you realize that your perceptions didn't line up with reality. There was some disconnect between that experience and the rest of your life. I didn't have that here. There was no disconnect. I was seeing things that I hadn't seen, feeling things that I hadn't felt before, but it didn't at all invalidate what my senses were showing me. And I was still able to cross the street and make a telephone call and to talk to people in a normal way. And I had this experience one other time, maybe 6 years later. And this one, interesting, I was living in Israel at the time. And this is after I came back very disappointed from my contact with the rabbis, because I just wasn't able, even though I identified so much with my tradition, I wasn't able to really grasp, take hold of what they had been talking about. And I was on a train going from northern Israel, Nahariya, down south to Tel Aviv, and I was reading in the paper about some guy, a missionary who got a calling from God, and he built his boat, gave away everything, and he built a boat and he brought his whole family, 5 little kids, over to Israel. And he was being held in the Haifa port until the authorities could make some sort of determination about him, because he had entered Israel illegally without a visa. And clearly he was a missionary. And the last thing Israel wanted was another missionary. So I was passing through Haifa at that moment. I decided I got to meet this guy. I got to get off the train and meet him. And I got into the harbor. I could speak a little Hebrew, and so I was told that there's no way that you can see him, because he is staying in this off limits Coast Guard area. But I found the station master, and he was intrigued by the fact that I wanted to see this guy. And he called up the Coast Guard area, and he asked whether this fellow countryman of yours could come down for a visit. And of course, the missionary said yes. And I went. I spent several hours with him on his boat, because I had to find out what made him tick, what made him so sure that he had received a calling from God to come over. And all they do is quote the Bible. I tell them, look, there's no point quoting the Bible to me. First, if you want it to be meaningful, first you got to prove that it's a word of God. And then you can quote it to me. But all he do is keep on quoting the Bible. So after a few hours, it was getting dark, and I decided to get up and leave. And his wife had come back on the boat, and she was getting ready to cook a meal. So he said, can I pray with you before you go? And I figured, this guy spent all these hours with me. The least I can do is allow him to pray for me. So he prayed. I got up to leave, and it was dark. He asked for my contact information in Israel. I gave it to him. And I headed out into Haifa. And suddenly, that same experience came upon me. I was filled with this love and joy and peace, and I couldn't figure it out. Again, every person I passed, I loved with this deep love. I even loved myself, which was probably even more unbelievable. And each sign, each rose, each flower, everything there had a purpose. It was all that was all interconnected. The amazing thing when I look back at this, the amazing thing is that I was so close to the idea that somehow The God to whom this man had prayed had somehow touched my heart. I still didn't get it. I was closed. Even though I went to see this guy.
So
He,
what I'm hearing you say is, okay, you've had this experience in Berkeley, and you had this experience with the chainsaw, and that convinced you that there was something more out there.
right, right.
Okay, and then you met this missionary who prayed for you, and that those experiences returned to you.
Yeah, yep. It came upon me in full force, and it was like I had entered into the twilight zone. But again, my perceptions were not changed. My hearing was not changed. My faculties were unchanged, but the sense of everything had changed.
So the sense of everything had changed. How did you figure out that that sense reflected something true?
Well, it was in the midst of that chainsaw debacle when I was bleeding to death that God revealed himself to me. I knew, don't ask me how I knew for sure that he was there, that he loved me, that he would take care of me. And it was then that I decided I need to find out the truth. I needed to find out who this God is because I had prayed before and I thought I wanted the truth, but I really, now in retrospect, I saw that I didn't really want the truth. What I wanted was something that would affirm me, something that would fit into my identity, into my worldview, and validate who I am. That's what I was looking for, essentially. And so this is the first time that I really, really needed to know who in the world this God is. Who is this person who somehow rescued me from death? And that led me to Jesus. But it wasn't easy because I'm the biggest skeptic in the world. And the idea of becoming a Christian was totally unacceptable to me. But I had vowed something to God. I had vowed that I wanted the truth. And I wouldn't stop until I found the truth. And so that carried me on.
So it was that Christian missionary that started the ball rolling for how you linked Christianity to that God?
No, well, I discounted anything to do with his religion. Actually, the one theory I came up with after my encounter with that missionary was that somehow he was so enthusiastic that somehow his enthusiasm had rubbed off on me. Somehow it was a psychological twist or trick. And if I could just learn to replicate it, I could always experience this. But of course, the next day I was back to the same old humdrum.
Hmm. So what got you moving towards Jesus then?
Well, when I was recuperating from that chainsaw injury in the hospital, these neighbors who rescued me brought me some books to read, and I read them. And I thought, gee whiz, this sounds just like the God I had encountered. And the books talked about, prayer meetings. And the idea of going to a church for me was nauseating. I mean, that's how deep my prejudice was. I didn't think I could really put up with even the odor. I was like a far out case. I mean, I'm not saying other Jews are like this. I was filled with rage. I was filled with hatred. I had experienced a lot of anti-Semitism growing up, and that was a lot that was behind my Zionism. I didn't think that living apart from Israel was an option for Jewish people. And so I was repulsed by the idea of going to a church. But I did read about these prayer groups and these Bible study groups, and I figured, well, maybe I can handle that. Maybe I can explore that because that seemed to be the direction as I prayed to this God that he was leading me. And so I found out, I made some inquiries, and I found out about a prayer meeting, and I went. And it was so weird to me, so different. I was pinching myself, wondering what in the world am I doing in this place?
How when
And people would look at me.
at what point where did you get married to your wife?
Okay, now my wife now, Anita, is my second wife.
Okay.
Uh, Anita and I, have been married now for 28 years.
Okay.
And so my first wife, we're great friends now, but we separated after 6 years
But were you
of
married
marriage.
when all this was going on
The
in your life?
change, yes, I was. But my wife wasn't interested.
And what background did she come from? Your first wife?
She came from an atheistic, secular, very typically French educated background. Her parents were university professors, and she had a passing casual interest in religion. And but she, after I became interested in the question of God, and I began to search. She didn't want to be anything. She didn't want any part of that.
Oh, okay. So did your move to Christianity, was that part of the reason why you two divorced?
Not exactly, but I'm not at liberty to go
Yeah, yeah.
into
I
why
just,
we.
yeah, I don't
Yeah,
want to get into
no,
details, but
that wasn't it. She wasn't interested. She didn't want to explore this with me. No interest whatsoever.
okay,
But later she did become a Christian,
okay.
and I was so touched that the Lord had used me. And so that created or recreated a very special bond between she and I and her husband and my wife, and we go spend time with them when the grandchildren come to their farm. They're still on a farm, and they spend the summer there. So Anita, my wife, we go out and we camp out. We bring our tents and we camp out on their porch, and we just stay there for 4 or 5 days and share the grandchildren, have a great time together.
What I'm very curious to know about you is how did you come to the conclusion that Christianity was true? Because I remember you saying earlier in the conversation that, don't quote the Bible to me unless you can show me this is God's
Yeah.
word. So let's
Oh, there it was a it was a slow and painful process because again, I was the biggest skeptic in the world, and I really didn't want to go there, but I had made a pledge. I came to know after that shameful experience that this God was was greater than my ethnicity, greater than my worldview commitments, greater than my identity, greater than any. So I committed that I needed to know the truth. I wanted to be connected to this God. And so I was committed. I was committed to finding out the truth. And I began to taste the sweetness of Jesus, that he had died for my sins, and that if he died for me, my sins were forgiven. And there was an unbreakable connection between me and God. And there was a joy in that. But then the next morning, I'd wake up and I'd think, well, I can't understand this. How can I believe this stuff? That somehow somebody got on a cross and suddenly God loves me? How can I allow myself to believe such stuff? So it was a struggle, and I was going back and forth. But all along, I was praying for the truth. And I asked God, you have to prove this to me. I just can't accept this stuff. And so, like one time, I needed to go to my surgeon because he had to check my wounds, and so the only vehicle I had was a stick truck, and I couldn't drive it anymore with my hand. And so I would have to hitchhike from way out in the boonies, dead end, dirt roads, and get to my surgeon. And so I said, God, if this stuff is about Jesus is for real, if you really did die for my sins, I really want you to make it plain for me. And I want you to give me some super rides hitchhiking. And some incredible things happen. One guy, way out in the boonies, when I started, I had put my hand out and he stopped. He rolled down the window. He just stared at me. And he says, I don't know why I'm stopping for you. He says, I have never stopped for any hitchhiker. I don't stop the hitchhikers. I don't know why I stop for you. And I just started to smile and laugh. And he says, well, you might as well get in. I've stopped. Oh, here's the door. Get in. So I got in. And then I would get these other incredible rides. Now, I'm not saying each time I asked for a sign from God, I got it. But there were many things that happened along the way that
But
confirmed for me.
what I'm curious to know about your experiences, though, is let's put aside the fact that you attributed these experiences to a god of some sort.
Yeah,
But how did you connect the dots between the Christian God and other views of God? Because you know as well as I do that Judaism and Christianity, they're two different gods. A lot of Jews would say you're an idolater if you worship Jesus. Same with Muslims.
yeah,
And so, how did you come to the conclusion, even with this hitchhiking experience, that maybe
right.
a God was answering your prayers, but it wasn't the Christian God? How did you put the dots together?
Well, these are good questions, and these are questions that I would ask myself because that's my nature, and I'm still a skeptic. I'm always second guessing myself, second guessing what I understand. In fact, I'm a teacher of theology and Bible and apologetics, and I guess my skepticism prepared me for this vocation. Anyway, I began to study the Bible with this little home Bible study fellowship. When I went to this strange prayer meeting, it was so strange to me, but there was a couple there, and I felt very strangely drawn to them. I'm not a people person, I don't connect to people very well. But this couple I felt so drawn to, and they came up to me afterwards and they invited me over their house to join their Bible study, and I did. And they were studying on prophecy, messianic prophecy. And it's something that I've studied for many, many years now. And I am convinced, because we've just been talking about subjective things until this point, but I became very convinced that the fulfillment of Bible prophecy is uncanny at the least, and that Jesus had fulfilled so many prophecies and so many other types of prophecies had been fulfilled. It was strange. And then I began to see, well, these miracles that the Bible claimed that Jesus performed. Jewish authorities, ancient Jewish authorities, the writers of the Talmud, their collected right, affirm the fact that Jesus produced miracles. In fact, some of the biggest skeptics in the world, the skeptics of the Jesus seminar, who were known for their very, very radical views, acknowledged also that historically there is no way around the fact that Jesus was an exorcist and a miracle worker.
Now, do you
Just-
think, as a skeptic, like, and I share that with you, that I view myself as a skeptic, when I see a writing that says that so and so, let's take it off Jesus, but just a particular individual did exorcisms or miracles or great things. How did you determine? How did you figure out that the difference between that actually being true and that's just a claim that's what happened? Because there's many claims in this world, and
yeah.
I don't think you and I would believe all of them. How did you end up saying, oh, these particular claims have to be true?
Okay, let's just start out with the most important miracle claim, and that's the claim of Jesus's resurrection.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever studied this out, but the historical evidence for his resurrection is so heavy, so impressive that skeptical philosophers, even atheists, skeptical atheist philosophers and historians will admit the fact that Jesus' disciples, over these 40-day period of his resurrection appearances, were convinced. Now, they don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe he rose from the dead, but they are convinced that Jesus's disciples and his apostles and all these people he appeared to over the 40-day period, they are convinced that these apostles were convinced of
Now,
these
what
resurrection appearances.
in your studies, what has been the best that you've seen or read? What has been the best argument against that so far?
What I have read is that all the theories the oppositional theories have really been invalidated. I'm not aware of any strong arguments against it. For instance, that Jesus' disciples had stolen the body away, and they cooked up this plot in order to start this new religion that would somehow benefit them. But the fact that so many of them died martyrs' deaths, and maybe even all of them, uh, without ever recanting. There's no historical record that any of them ever recanted their testimony that Jesus had risen. The fact that they went to their death without recanting really vouches for their belief that this actually took place.
I
You
had
know,
I had a biblical historian on a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was 3 weeks ago, Richard Carrier, and I know a lot of
he's a
people.
lone voice.
He's not a lone voice, but I know a lot of people disagree with him on a lot of things. But does it bother you that if you look at secular historians and Jewish historians, and as a being raised Jew, I'm sure you can appreciate this, they see things very differently on the prophecies, and even the secular historians, even on the claims of the resurrection. There's very little that they agree on when it comes to Jesus. In fact, I think it's only 3 or 4 things. How did you come to the conclusion? How did you figure out that, no, these secular historians and these Jewish historians are wrong and the Christian historians are right?
Evidence. That's all I can say.
But they're looking at the same evidence as the Christian historians. So what's going on here?
People have their presuppositions, their worldview commitments, and these are very, very powerful. We call this a confirmation bias. People look for that type of data that will confirm their position, and they will twist other types of data.
I agree, but how do you know you're not that person who has this confirmation bias confirmation bias is rife among Christians, and it's also rife among non-Christians. But how do we actually work together to figure out what's really true? And how do we kind of suppress those biases as much as possible?
Well, Doug, if you're looking for a formula about how to gain consensus among these differing point of views, I'm at a loss. I think our differences are very deep, and I don't know how. But if you're asking me the question, how I know, it's very simple. Have you ever seen those books called The Magic Eye? They contain all these computer-generated images, and they look like a big hodgepodge, but there's a secret image within them. Have you ever seen those books?
No, sorry.
Well, somehow, if you let your eyes go limp, oftentimes you will see the image.
Oh, you're talking about like it almost looks like 3D?
Yeah,
And
right.
you kind of, okay, yeah, those I've seen, yes.
Okay, and I have a number of these books. I love these books for some reason. I don't know why. But, suddenly this image comes into focus and clarity, and it's very clear that it's a whale or it's a horse or it's a unicorn or something like that. And, you could think, well, maybe it's my mind that is creating this image. Maybe my mind has a certain power that I could see these things and just see the lines that I want to see that form the image that I want to believe is there or do believe is there. Well, it's very simple, because you could look in the back of the book. And the back of the book has the answers, the actual images, the hidden images that are embedded in these computer-generated designs. And each time I see the image, I look in the back of the book and voila, there it is. I know that I see these images. In the same way I've investigated the evidence. Again, I'm the biggest skeptic in the world. I've investigated this evidence. And I am so impressed that I see what I see. I know what I see. I can't account for the other people who disagree. I can't say why they don't see what I see, that they discount the evidence that I see as that. I can't explain that. I recognize what you're saying. I know that there are these radical differences between the way people evaluate this evidence or the conclusions they come to.
Yeah, see, here's my problem that maybe you can help me out with, but if, and I hate to pick on the Muslims on because they often are picked on, but if you and I were to look at the Quran and let's say you and I were talking to a Muslim right now in this live stream, they would say, "Of course, the Quran is the word of Allah. Like it's just beautifully written, and it's been shown to be 80% scientifically proven, and all these things." And get this, almost all the Quranic scholars are agreed that this is the word of Allah. Like if you just look at the evidence, it's overwhelming. And you and I would look at each other and say, well, yeah, of course the majority of Quranic scholars would say this because the majority of them are Muslim.
Sure. Sure. I think the issue is still the same. The issue is, we, we know that they're Muslim, and they're going to be impressed with the style, and they're going to say things like, well, only God could create such a book.
Mm-hmm.
Look at this style, look at the poetry, look at this and that. And, to us, it would seem like, well, even if I could appreciate the style, even if I could read Arabic and I could see, oh my gosh, what wonderful poetry. Well, human beings can create wonderful poetry. Human beings like Bach and Mozart and Beethoven can create beautiful music. But this doesn't mean that because it's beautiful or because it's intricate, it's because it's over my head. It doesn't mean that God created it.
Exactly. And so just because the majority of Quranic scholars say that it's the word of Allah doesn't make it true. And just because the majority of Christian scholars say this is the word of God or that Jesus rose from the dead also doesn't make it true.
Well, sure, I agree with you. I think,
Okay.
majority might rule in certain circumstances, but the majority doesn't decide truth.
So then how do we figure out, like you look at verses in the Bible that say 500 people saw the risen Jesus.
Yeah.
How do we determine whether that actually happened or if a book just says it did?
Okay. Again, it's a matter of the evidence. It's a matter of not only the various accounts of the Bible all saying the same thing. These are different writers. It's also a matter of the fathers of the church who knew the apostles. They're all saying the same thing. Another piece of evidence is that, Muhammad was a great warrior. And he was able to secure a great amount of booty for his followers, booty in terms of riches and women, and that rates for something, and for many people. But Jesus's death and Jesus's life was the opposite. From a human perspective, his death ended it all. In fact, we read in the accounts, instead of the apostles, the writers, saying, "Oh, look at the courage we had. We saw his death, but we persevered. We believed what he had told us." No, that's not what you see. Instead, they all ran away. They all disavowed their faith. They were all in hiding. They were afraid that the same thing that happened to Jesus would also happen to them. And we have many accounts of that. And in fact, these accounts are so self-depreciating that anybody who wanted to create a religion wouldn't present themselves in such a negative light as they had presented themselves. And
How did you
the church.
can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
How did you exclude, as a skeptic, how did you exclude the possibility that this was like a passion narrative or a screenplay where you have flawed characters within the story to make the story interesting and to kind of have that struggle and then the triumph at the end? How did you exclude that possibility?
Well, for one thing, these writers, these men, they died never invalidating their testimony and what they had written and what they had taught.
But
They went to their
how do you know that?
history. There are many historical accounts of these things. The fact that The fact that the church grew exponentially in the very place, Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified, where they saw Jesus stripped naked, dying the most horrific and most humiliating death imaginable, and they came to believe. There must have been something that caused them to believe. Take Paul's life, for instance. Paul was somebody like me. He hated Christians. He felt that Christians were undermining Judaism, and he was the leading figure in persecuting the church. He brought Christians to their death. And something made him change. Something made him become a Christian. And that must have been something miraculous. Same with Jesus's brothers. Jesus's brothers couldn't believe that he was the Messiah.
Hey,
They
Daniel,
thought he was going out of his mind.
Daniel, what I want to do is very briefly explain to you why, like you've gave, I don't know, 5 or 6 reasons, pieces of evidence, and I just very briefly want to tell you why I, as a skeptic, reject them.
Sure.
And you can tell me what you think at the end. So you mentioned martyrs. We really don't know how any of the disciples died. The Bible doesn't say. In fact, you have to go to extra biblical traditions in order to figure that out.
Sure.
Most of them written, up to a century later. Right next to other things which I think you and I would think is not true, there's these accounts. So we really don't know how they died. We don't know if they recanted. Maybe they recanted and they were still killed because of sedition or whatever other reason. Maybe they recanted and it just wasn't recorded that they recanted. We don't know. There's just so many things we don't know. So that's one thing why the martyrs doesn't do anything for me, to be honest.
Okay. Well, here's some considerations.
But let me just I just want to sort of pluck these off one at a time.
Sure.
What was another thing you mentioned? Prophecies. Again, there's so many smart people in this world who do this for a living, who study history and know the original languages and so forth. And I'm sure you can appreciate the Orthodox Jews who know the Torah better than any other people on this planet, and they don't see what Christians see. And in fact, the secular historians and the Orthodox Jews are very much aligned on a lot of the prophecies, not all, but and I look at prophecies and I can very quickly make them better. Like if it said that, that would be so much better of a prophecy. And so when I see a prophecy that can be improved upon very easily, I kind of go, well, maybe it's not a good prophecy to begin with. So that's why I don't believe in prophecies. What else did you mention? I think Paul's Jesus in the epistles is very different than the synoptic gospel Jesus. And Mark, the first gospel, to me reads like a passion narrative, like a screenplay, a story that you and I, in any other screenplay, wouldn't automatically say, oh, this is historically true. In fact, it ends with a cliffhanger in Mark, and the last 8 verses or 12 verses was added, a century or two later. And so Jesus, this person Jesus didn't even become God until, actually in the other Gospels, because it's really unknown what happened to this Jesus and the original cliffhanger. So I look at all these things and I ask myself, okay, what evidence do we really have? Like we see these people who claim, there's a claim of people who saw something. It's a claim. That's the evidence we have. We have evidence of claims, not evidence of necessarily what happened. Like, I'm sure you and I would both agree that there's many people whose lives have been transformed that believe in false things. We would both agree that religions have flourished. Look at Mormonism. In my opinion, one of the craziest religions out there, yet it's still flourishing today. And it's one of the most, it's hard for Mormons to leave Mormonism. That's how much they believe it and love it. And yet you and I probably would agree it's false. So the growth of a religion doesn't make it true. The uniqueness doesn't make it true. We have all these differences in opinion on what is actually true in the Gospels and what isn't, and what can be verified. And so I hope you can understand, like a guy like me, I'm being honest and sincere with you. I value truth, I think, just as much as you do. But a guy like me looks at all these things and say, look, maybe Jesus was God in flesh. Maybe. But based on the evidence or lack thereof, I just can't commit to that. Because if I do, what else am I almost forced to believe on equal evidence? Does that make sense?
Well, what makes sense to me is the fact that you care about evidence, and I care about evidence too, and I esteem that, and I appreciate your concerns, and so where would you like me to start?
Well, I guess, let me ask you this. What would change your mind?
Oh my gosh.
What would you have to see where you would say, you know what? And let's not even tackle the God question. Let's just tackle the Jesus question.
That is like asking me what I would need to change my mind that Anita is my wife. Not that she is always going to be my wife, but just that she's my wife now. Or what would I need to change my mind that I'm talking to you right now? Now, I don't want to take the extreme position where, well, there's no evidence possible. I don't want to, that's extreme. I don't want to say that, but I cannot imagine what evidence anybody might provide me with to make me doubt that I'm talking to you right now over this, whatever you call it. In the same way that there is really, I don't want to say there's no evidence. Maybe I'm wrong about Anita being my wife, but I can't imagine anybody presenting any evidence that would change my mind. Likewise, I can't imagine anybody presenting any evidence
Okay,
to
I
shake.
understand that. Let me rephrase it then. Not what evidence or what would you have to see, not to change your mind, but at least lower your confidence that it's true. So that you would be more willing to say, you know what? Yeah, I can see this. I could be wrong. I still believe it. I still believe it. But my confidence is lowered a little bit.
And I'm definitely amenable to evidence. And so there are things that I could imagine that could lower my confidence. In fact, I'm one of these. I have this really cranky personality that when a doubt crosses my mind, I can't just dismiss it. I embrace it. I've got to work through it. I've got to challenge it somehow. And so I'm very amenable to argumentation and evidence. And so I could imagine that there are forms of evidence that would shake me up. Now, to give you an example, I'm a creationist.
Okay.
I don't believe in macroevolution.
Okay.
I believe in the biblical account that God created as he said he did. But yet, and I'm not a scientist, so some of these questions, some of these challenges that come my way, I'm unable to deal with, at least to my satisfaction. For instance, somebody told me that one piece of evidence in favor of macroevolution is that when we look at the various strata, we see the microorganisms on the bottom and the least complex organisms, on levels above that, which kind of, I don't know, again, with my scientific expertise, which is not very high at all. I'm not able to answer certain questions, so I'm left with lingering doubts, even though I'm a strong, rigid, maybe I could say that, a rigid creationist. Yet I can't answer every piece of
So what?
every
So
doubt.
you mentioned evolution, and I just had a guy on who loves Jesus as much as you do, I believe, and he believes in evolution via common descent. But what can you think of evidence that would, like, very simple type evidence that you can think of that you would believe in evolution?
Well, if they were able to fill in the gap, say, of the missing links, between these various fossil forms, the various phylum, if they could provide that, that would take away a powerful argument. And the fossil record is really central to the evolutionary case. But yet there are such problems with it that even even anthropologists acknowledge that the evidence is not there. The evidence that the person on the street thinks is there
But
for the
what happens is, in my experience, when someone says, "I wish they could fill in those gaps, those missing links," and when someone provides them evidence, "Oh, here, look, here's the missing link." No, but you got to explain that link or that species to that species, and so it's never good enough.
well, understandably, because one piece of evidence is presented against so many other considerations that I would have, and maybe other creationists would have, in favor of creation and against macroevolution. So you're not just dealing with one little piece of evidence, but you're dealing with the weight of all these other considerations.
But you would say that if you became convinced, let's say 5 years from now, that evolution via common descent was true, that would weaken your belief in Jesus?
It would definitely weaken my belief that the Bible is fully the Word of God, and that's what I believe.
Okay.
And so I'd have to admit that I would be vulnerable in that area. I wouldn't. It's not necessarily that I would give up my belief in Jesus, but it would make it more awkward.
Let's say you became convinced that just one of the prophecies in the Old Testament that you thought was fulfilled wasn't, or that it was just wrong.
Well, again, we'd have to look at the prophecy, and then we'd have to look at this one prophecy stacked up against hundreds of other prophecies. And so it would remain that these hundreds of prophecies would take precedence over this one prophecy that has been overthrown.
But like, I know this sounds kind of like a childish question, but it is sincere. Like, do you think it has to be up to 50% of the prophecies have to be true before you would start doubting? Or like, what percentage of the prophecies would you have to doubt in order for you to doubt all of them?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, for me, I'm a, you know, each one of us is a complex collection of factors. I mean, there's so many things that go into my confidence in Jesus, not just the things I experience, but many, many objective considerations that it would cause me discomfort because that's the way I am. If some part of my belief system could be overthrown, yeah, it would be very uncomfortable. And whenever something like that happens, I'm totally destabilized. That's just my personality. Even when I realize that, hey, what are you getting destabilized about? There's just one factor out of hundreds. Why does it matter? But that's the way I am. So yeah, it would affect me.
Okay. Would
And Doug, I just wanted to throw in something. I really appreciate your tone. And even though you're asking direct questions, I think they're very needful and they're very important. So, don't. Uh, I feel that as you said before, you're a skeptic or a non-believer who is civil. You are civil, and I do appreciate that.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to give you the opportunity to ask me. You can ask me anything you want as well, because I'm asking these questions of you because I do have skin in this game. My whole family are born again believers. My wife is a born again believer. I used to be one. And if you're a Calvinist, I profess to be one. And so the whole issue of, was Jesus who he said claimed to be in the Gospels, is that true or not, does mean something to me even on an emotional level.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I think you can tell that the question marks I have in my mind, that I just don't, because the Bible says something, I don't automatically believe it.
Sure.
Even the things where it says that people saw a risen Jesus, I just don't automatically believe that, because if I just automatically believe that actually happened, then I might as well just read the part where it says Jesus is God in the book of John. He loves you. He died for your sins. I just have to read those parts and I'm done. I don't need any evidence. Like if I take the Bible at face value on those other
Sure.
things. You see what
Sure.
I'm saying?
Yeah, sure.
So then I asked myself, what's more likely? That a guy was dead for 2 to 3 days and did indeed rise from the dead, or that these texts just claim that's what happened, and maybe it didn't for whatever reason. Maybe it's a screenplay, maybe it's a passion play, maybe they were hallucinating. Who knows? There's all those theories. But to me, the hardest part I have to wrap my brain around is that all those other explanations to me seem still more likely than the one you believe in.
So, which explanation do you feel is the likeliest?
I think the screenplay one. I actually think Christianity was started by Paul, not by the Gospels. But um, I do, or the Christianity that we see today, anyhow. But I do think that there is a problem between Matthew, Mark, Luke. I do see a huge problem between those three Gospels, and in that I don't see them as three separate sources. I see them as, at best, one,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe not even one, because Luke and Matthew borrow heavily from Mark, and and you look at the order of a lot of the stories are the same. Some of it's word for word. Mark borrows heavily. I think it's 20% from the Old Testament. Some of it's like straight out of the Old Testament. And so maybe there was an apocalyptic preacher named Jesus who came out of the Essene movement way back then, preaching this type of gospel. Who knows? But I think that I look at the Gospels, and I think if you and I knew everything about the Old Testament, we had the whole Torah memorized, and if we saw this guy named Jesus from the Essene movement, I think you and I, Daniel, you and I alone could have written the Gospel of Mark just based on that, without hardly any of it being true. So if that's possible, if you agree with that, that it's at least possible that you and I could have written the Gospel of Mark if we knew the Torah well, if we knew, let's say, even some ancient Greek history and knew of this, maybe it was based on a real guy named Jesus. And then everything can just, so this is my theory, and I admit, I could be totally wrong about all this. But a lot of secular historians, I think, agree with at least some of what I'm saying.
You're right. You're right.
Matthew and Luke kind of just snowballed from Mark. John is very, how do I say it?
Different.
It's different. It's out there.
Yeah.
It's the whole concept of the logos and everything concepts that came even before him. Paul's the most interesting. His letters are what's really interesting about the New Testament to me. But yeah, but that's basically what it boils down to for me is that, and I talked to a guy named Mike Brown. If you ever want to watch, he's a seminary student, and he was very upset at me because I have this whole concept of what's more likely, because that's what I keep saying. And he said, no, you can't ask that question of historical texts, because you're automatically biasing yourself of what's possible. And I admit
Yeah.
miracles are possible. I do believe that, Daniel. I believe that they could be possible, especially if there's a God out there, and depending on how you define miracle. But I just can't automatically believe it just because the book says so.
I don't. I don't. I don't fault you for that. I think it does come back to the testimony of the historical texts of the Bible. I do believe, but yet I think that the evidence is far more weighty in favor of these accounts, these testimonies, than you do.
Yeah.
And we could discuss various aspects of the reliability of these texts. That's totally legitimate, and so we could proceed from there if you want. But I don't approve of what the seminary student said. I think you're perfectly within your rights to weigh these different options according to the evidence. That's totally okay. And so I don't think to become a Christian requires us to close our mind off. In fact, I would argue that this is the very thing Jesus told us not to do. He even said, look, if I'm just speaking on my own, don't believe me. Or if I'm not doing these miracles, don't believe me. Don't just because you like my message or you're kind of stirred by my charisma, something like that. Don't go by that. You need hard evidence, and that's the same thing that you're asking for. So I have no problem with that. But the conclusions and the nature of the evidence itself, we might have some grounds for dispute.
Yeah. How would your life change if, let's say, you became convinced that Jesus wasn't God or that Jesus didn't rise from the dead?
I would probably revert to my former depression and former panic attacks, which were so utterly devastating. Because my whole life, the way I regard my life now, it's built upon Jesus. It's built upon confidence that he loves me. He defines me. I don't have to prove myself anymore. I don't have to be anything that I'm not. I can be real. That he's my security. He's my foundation. He's my hope. If you take that away from me, I have nothing.
So your answer that you just gave, I think, is the real reason you believe, not because of the evidence.
Now there you're coming to a conclusion that goes beyond the evidence.
I could be wrong, but here's why I say that. I could be wrong, Daniel, but I think the panic attacks you had for most of your life prior to becoming a Christian, the depression that you went through, when you had these experiences, and I'm not saying you're special, I'm saying all humans have this. Mm-hmm. These experiences happen, and please understand, I'm not diminishing your experiences at all. Mm-hmm. I kind of envy you in a way. But these experiences, I think, bias, it paints a picture of how we see the world.
Oh, definitely, right? Sure. And I agree with you there, sure.
And not always is it a perfect picture that's being painted.
And in many cases, it's not. I agree with you.
Yeah. And so when I hear you say that if you were to stop believing, you would revert back to depression and anxiety attacks, I think that's what got you into the belief in the first place, the need to have this problem solved, and Christianity solved it for you.
That is definitely part of the formula. But I don't think you have any basis to reject the other things that I'm talking about that are also very part of the formula. I don't simply believe because I want to believe, and that has become a factor now. I'm not going to deny that. Sure, I want to believe in Jesus. He's everything to me. Of course I want to believe in him. But I don't think you can so easily dismiss these other claims, these other considerations that I have for my relationship with Jesus.
I agree. But it does explain some things as far as, like, I'll take it off you. Let's take it to a different religion, and even a non-Abrahamic religion. Let's take Hinduism. If someone has this experience of Vishnu or Ganesh, and it paints a picture in their mind of the Vedas become real to them all of a sudden. It makes sense. You hear that all the time. People saying, I believe X because X makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. And so these experiences help paint this picture of what makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so when you say, well, Doug, don't discount all these other reasons I have, what I'm saying, it could be possible that the reason why you see the evidence in a way different than, let's say, a secular historian would on, let's say, the Gospels, is because of this picture that's been painted for you from your personal experiences. It makes sense to you that this is true.
Yeah. And I can understand where you'd come to this type of conclusion because you've seen this type of phenomena, as you correctly point out, in many other people. Yet, what we have been talking about now, which we've just been skimming the surface of, is objective reasons too, not just the subjective reasons. Not, and the last thing, again, I have to come back to the fact the last thing I wanted was Jesus. What I did want was to find God through my own traditions, which I wasn't able to. If I had any motivation to come to a belief system, I was totally identifying with Judaism and Jewish culture and Jewish history and all that whole Jewish stick. That was my thing.
Hmm.
And so I trust what I see. In the same way, going back to the analogy of those computer generated images, I know what I see. And yeah, other people think that they know what they see and they happen to be wrong. I know that that is the case. But there are certain things that we know. And yes, I admit that I have reasons for knowing what I know, but that doesn't condition the fact that I still know what I know, what I see, and I know the evidence, and I know the way that I have evaluated these things objectively. In some ways, I'm a very weak person, but in other ways, I feel that God has equipped me with a singular ability to be very objective. I don't want to put myself on a pedestal because I don't belong there. Like I say, I have many, many faults, weaknesses, and so, but that's not one of them. I know what I know.
You know what you know. The motto of my channel is doubt is a virtue.
Oh, I believe that too. See, that's how I've come to know what I know. I've come to know what I know because I've doubted it from every different angle. That is, I couldn't shake off doubts. I had to work through them. And so through this work, I feel I've come up with a coherent picture of reality, like those images that appear, in those computer generated designs. I know
But
what I
what would you
know.
say to, uh, do I dare use a Muslim example? No, I'll use a Hindu one. Back to Hinduism. What would you say to a Hindu who says, Daniel, I know that Vishnu is real in my life?
Mhm.
You and I would say they're wrong,
Well,
but
I would ask him for evidence, as you're asking me for evidence. I would ask him for evidence. How do you know? How do you know that you know? Okay, you had a feeling, but other people have a feeling. Maybe the feeling was caused by something else, the experience. How do you know that this is real? And even if you say you had an image and some God appeared to you, how do you know it's not a demon? There are a lot of reasons for skepticism.
mm-hmm.
And I'm convinced, again, we can go into the specifics of it, but I'm convinced that Christianity has stood admirably countless attacks over the century and countless of areas of skepticism.
I've had you on the hot seat for a while now. I don't know. Have we been going an hour? Um, but do you want to ask me anything?
I'm kind of curious. Okay, you were a committed Christian, and as you kind of hinted, you wanted to remain a committed Christian. And yet you have stated that the evidence was overwhelming in the other direction. Now, if you claim for me that what I wanted was able to overcome the evidence, my evidence, why were you different? Why was it that what you wanted wasn't able to overcome the quote evidence that you had been confronted with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think just like your life, my journey out of Christianity was a process of 5 years, and I wouldn't say that it was evidence that um, took me out of the belief, but it was more like a lack of evidence that kept preventing me from staying in it. So I started viewing myself from a third party vantage point. I think that's what started it. So I would, as a Christian, say, okay, why is that person over there? How are they viewing me in the things I'm saying? What is going inside their head when I say I believe because of prophecies, or I believe because of Jesus was either a liar, lunatic, or Lord? That was one of my favorites. Like C.S. Lewis's trilemma argument. What are they thinking when I say this and they just like brush me off? Like, some of these people are very intelligent, very sincere, very nice, but they just don't believe like I do. So I started viewing myself from a third party vantage point and really understanding different viewpoints and why people just don't buy it. And it started to resonate with me a little. Oh, I understand why they don't believe it as strongly as I do. And yeah, and after 5 years, I kind of was at a position where, oh yeah, there has to be a God though. Like, something can't come from nothing. And I don't know if I used the moral argument, but so that's why I called myself a deist. But then after a few years, I think deism is like a top of a mountain. A deist is someone who stands right on top, and depending on which way the wind blows, you're either going to fall into atheism or fall into theism. And maybe it didn't even take a year, but it was like, I don't live my life like there's a God, and even if it's a deistic God, there's no difference between a deistic God and no God. So I might as well call myself an unbeliever, which is an atheist. I don't say there is no God. I don't say that there can't be one. In general, I think specific gods you can be atheistic on, contradictory gods. But yeah, that's what happened.
But Doug, what I could do, you've made yourself vulnerable in a sense, and so I could raise the same types of skeptical issues that you raised with me.
Sure.
And I could say, is it possible then that what people thought of you, or social acceptance, was such a powerful force in your life that it was able
Oh no, it
to
wasn't social acceptance.
influence you?
It wasn't social acceptance. If you ask any of my close friends, they'll tell you I'm a maverick. I didn't want to please people. I just really wanted to understand them.
But what you were talking about, and I'm not saying that this was the case with you. I can't really analyze what's going on inside a person, but I'm just weighing these skeptical considerations. And what you were talking about is you were seeing yourself from the third person, from the way other people were regarding you. And this really seemed to have a big impact upon you, as you explained it. And so maybe your skepticism about the Christian faith was a product to some degree of what you thought other people were thinking about your Christian
Yeah,
faith.
let me give you a specific example. I was raised believing that the Gospels were eyewitness accounts. And so when I would say that to the unbeliever, and they would say, "What are you talking about?" No, they're not. And then in my mind I would say, "What are they talking about? Of course they are." And then I started doing some research on it, and basically doubting the core propositions that I was raised with, without the fear of going to hell or anything like that, and saying, "Okay, maybe they're right. Maybe they're not eyewitness accounts. And here's why they believe that. And I can understand why they believe that and why they say that."
But Doug, are you aware of alternative theories for the fact you pointed out very correctly
Mm-hmm.
that with the three synoptic gospels, certain accounts are almost word for word, and that's true.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other theories by which you can account for this fact, other than assuming or jumping to the conclusion that there was collusion and they aren't three separate eyewitness accounts.
Sure.
Uh, have you explored those other theories? Did you want to explore those other theories?
Sure. Those are the theories that I grew up with.
And so, why did this theory, this particular theory, this theory of collusion or one eyewitness account and expanded into three, why did that hold sway in your mind over the other theories?
Great question. What it boils down to is what I said earlier about the where I got in trouble with this guy named Mike Brown. It's what's more likely question,
Uh huh.
and I was left with saying, okay, what's more likely that these are eyewitness accounts and it actually everything that it claims to have happened actually did happen, or is it more likely that it is maybe a screenplay or a passion narrative or different perspectives of Matthew and Luke compared to Mark where they're different, and that maybe the core propositions are not true.
Well, let me contrast your reasoning with, say, my reasoning about on this specific subject. Again, when I was confronted with those theories, they were weighty and they were disturbing to me, and yet I was committed to learning the truth and to see whether I could understand this particular phenomena from the point of view of the revealed Christian faith and the historic faith. And I found that there were many different ways I could, but evidently you didn't do that. You have decided for some reason, and you haven't explained why, some reason that it's more likely that there was collusion rather than these other theories of why you have
No,
this.
I want to correct you there, Daniel. I've never used the word collusion. What I'm saying is that let's get right to the bare bones of it. You have to ask yourself, I had to ask myself the question, what's more likely? A man rose from the dead after 2 days, or a book just says that happened and maybe it didn't? For whatever reason, that is the core
Sure.
question.
And so why is it more likely to you that Jesus didn't rise after 2 or 3 days?
Ah,
Why is that less likely than a more naturalistic explanation?
okay, that's a great question. I'm stealing this from someone, but I'll answer this way. If I told you that I had a gray Dodge minivan, that's my claim. I own a Dodge gray minivan. You probably would protest not one bit. You'd say, oh, okay, that's nice to know, Doug. I really don't care, but you have a Dodge gray minivan. But what if I told you now that I own a nuclear ballistic missile?
No, you're right. That's more incredible, and I'd be less
Now,
likely to
but
believe that. Sure,
that's still possible, right? Like there are
it's possible. Sure.
nuclear missiles in the world, and I might be part of some organization that happens to own one. I'm not, but so that is possible. But in order for you to believe that claim, you would need more evidence than I own a minivan. I could take a picture of the minivan, and you would say, "Oh, that's good enough for me." But I could take a picture of a nuclear missile off the internet, and you would say, "No, that's not good enough for me. I need more," because you just took that off the internet.
Well, sure.
So, but what if I take it one step further and say to you, Daniel, I own an interstellar spacecraft that can go from one galaxy to another at warp speed, faster than the speed of light. Now we've even upped it, haven't we?
Well, sure. That's right.
You would not only want to see it, but you would want to travel in it to see that if it's actually true or not. So you notice the progression that for each claim, you'd want
Definitely.
more. Jesus any man rising from the dead after 2 or 3 days, being fully dead, fully alive, that, in my opinion, is into the interstellar vehicle mode of it, requirement for evidence. And so just like you would want more for that interstellar spacecraft, my personal opinion, I want more than what we have in the Gospels in order for me to believe it. And there could be more.
what we're talking about essentially is the the basic paradigm that I think separates us. I believe in the supernatural. Evidently, you have committed yourself to a natural. Tell me
No,
if I'm
no,
wrong,
you're
but
wrong. You're wrong.
a naturalistic.
You're wrong. I haven't committed
Oh,
myself to that.
so you do believe in the
No,
supernatural?
I believe it is. I am open to that idea.
Hmm.
Now, do I believe it currently? No. But do I say that it cannot exist? No.
Okay, so basically you're a naturalist. I mean, basically you resort to naturalistic explanations. Am I right?
Yeah, I think it seems like the world operates that way, but I can be changed, and I can give you an example
Okay.
of what would change
Okay.
my mind.
Let me challenge you on this then, if you don't mind. Can you give me one example of anything that has ever happened naturalistically without intelligence?
Ripples in sand dunes?
Well, aren't these ripples in the sand dunes uh, weren't they created based upon scientific forces that are calculable, that are immutable? And I mean, in other words, the movement of molecules, aren't they all governed by these laws of science?
Yes.
Well, how do you know? What you're saying in essence is that these laws of science are natural and not intelligent. How do you prove that? What evidence do you have that any causation, anything has ever happened naturally?
Yeah. My, I have no reason to think at this point, and again, I want to be very clear about this. There could be a supernatural realm. There could be this almighty, all powerful God out there who set the ball in motion. I don't know.
Okay. But Doug, you have committed yourself to a certain
No,
paradigm.
no, I
Okay, you
haven't.
acknowledge
I
you
haven't.
acknowledge the possibility,
Yes.
but I think the things that you're gravitating to, I mean, based upon the things you've said, are naturalistic explanations. But
Yes.
yet you're acknowledging that there is no evidence that anything has ever taken place naturalistically.
There's no evidence that nothing has taken place
That
naturalistically.
anything has ever taken place without intelligence and just the result of natural forces.
You, I don't understand your question. I'm sorry, Daniel.
Okay, what I'm saying is that we of this society have been brainwashed. So science has been brainwashed. Science is committed to a philosophy called naturalism. Naturalism says that the only types of explanations that we will entertain are naturalistic explanations. And yet it's clearly philosophical. It's not a scientific point of view because I've challenged you. I've challenged you to show me, is there any evidence that anything has ever happened naturalistically without intelligence? And I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think you have acknowledged that the forces of science, there's no evidence that they're naturalistic. That the causal forces behind everything, or almost everything, are these laws of science that govern the movement of molecules. And so, is there any evidence that any of it's naturalistic? And if you can offer evidence, then you've overthrown what I'm saying. My challenge.
So your challenge is to show evidence that things happen naturalistically.
Yeah, that anything has ever happened naturalistically.
Can you give an example of what evidence you would accept?
Anything.
So,
Anything. You mentioned the sand dunes, and you see the patterns in the sand dunes, or the patterns in the waves and everything. And I countered by saying, okay, these sand dunes and these waves and whatever phenomena we see, yeah, we would probably both agree that there are laws of science that govern these movements
mm-hmm.
and these results, that these things are causal. And yet, okay. Okay, but do you have any evidence that these laws work naturalistically without intelligence?
Well, I think there's evidence that there's uniformity in nature. Would you agree with that?
Oh, well, of course I do.
But
But
that's
and so
not.
we both accept that laws exist, and these laws underlie science. They underlie knowledge. They underlie
Uh,
scientific
hey, Daniel, let
findings.
me ask you: are you asking me for evidence that there isn't a God?
I'm asking you for evidence for your paradigm. Okay, you say, well, other things are possible, but it seems like certain conclusions are governing your life and your worldview.
There's
And so
yeah,
I'm
okay.
I'm asking for evidence here.
So my paradigm, as you put it, is I view it in terms of confidence. So let's say I have this paradigm of a materialistic worldview, but I'm still open to something else, a different realm, so to speak. My confidence, for example, that when I hold this pen and I let go, that it will fall downwards is very, very high.
Sure,
And it's repeatable.
exactly.
And so
Well,
I'm
we
very,
both believe in science. That's no issue.
okay. So,
And we
so I still don't know what you're getting at. If you want evidence that there is no God, I cannot prove a negative. You're right there.
no, but you're committed, and science is
I'm not
committed
committed.
to a oh, to some degree. I mean, it does govern your conclusions. We're talking about Jesus's
Yeah.
resurrection,
Yeah.
and it seems to have some sort of bearing there. So I'm just simply asking you for why you believe certain types of explanations are more reasonable or likely than others.
Yes, that question I can answer. And I'll go back to the pen. So let's compare the pen to Jesus. My confidence is high that when I let go of the pen, it will fall. Very high.
Sure.
And in fact, I would say I know I can predict with knowledge that it will fall when I let go. But my confidence in Jesus rising from the dead is very low. Does that mean I'm saying it didn't happen? No. But I'm saying that my confidence that it did is very low, whereas my confidence in the pen is very high.
Okay, you compared, and we're getting a little off the subject now, but you compared, you having some interstellar vessel,
Yeah.
which is highly improbable, and I grant you that, with a very different type of claim. And the claim here is that not because I don't believe that you can perform the supernatural and suddenly come up with that. Now, maybe you could, but I have no reason. But I do believe in supernatural, and I do believe these things can happen. I do believe that God can intervene. I have no problem with that type of paradigm. Evidently, for some reason, you dismiss that type of
No, I
reasoning.
don't.
Well, let me just rephrase it in your terms. What you're saying is that it's more likely that there's a naturalistic explanation for these sightings of Jesus and all that. And I've challenged you, about naturalism. Does anything ever happen naturally? Because I think that this naturalistic explanation, to just apply it to everything, is really bogus. And if you have evidence otherwise, then I would challenge you to present it.
So if everything, are you saying there's nothing that's
There's
natural?
no evidence. There's no evidence that anything has ever happened naturally without intelligence.
So you
No
don't.
evidence
So are you
whatsoever.
saying you don't believe in the natural world?
Of course I do, but I believe that we call it natural, but I believe actually that it's supernatural because it's God who holds things together. I believe that God underlies the laws of
So
science.
how do you
For
tell the difference
instance,
between natural and supernatural then? If everything that I call natural is actually supernatural, how do you distinguish between the two?
well, I don't distinguish those types of things. What I do distinguish is between direct intelligent causation and formulaic causation. Formulaic causation is the causation that the laws of science perform. But the laws of science can't write poetry. They can't do other things that are directly attributable to intelligence, even though the laws themselves are attributed to intelligence.
So would you say this is a natural event or a supernatural, the pen dropping?
I would fundamentally, it's supernatural.
Okay, then I believe in a supernatural too then. If
But
you're
but
calling this supernatural, then I guess I do too.
okay, but when I'm saying supernatural, because I think we're saying two different things here. When I'm saying supernatural, I'm saying that there's a God who holds everything together, who designed everything, who keeps the laws functioning in an immutable and universal way. And so all of these things point back to a God. I think there's overwhelming evidence for a God. And so, we're not just playing with words, we're playing with the deepest concepts that surrounds all existence.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people listening want me to ask, name one piece of evidence for God. Um, but let me answer that question on your behalf. That the universe had a beginning. Is that one of them, you would say?
Yeah. Now, I wouldn't pose it that way, though. But there's something called the cosmological argument. There's
Mm-hmm.
something called the argument from first cause. Let me just try to explain that a little bit. That there has to be something that is eternal and uncaused.
Yeah.
Because if you're asking the question, where did everything come from? Where did the universe come from? Well, you can say that the universe always existed. Time and matter and space always existed. But you got logical problems that you're dealing with, tremendous logical problems when you say that. For instance, let's just take time. Science tells us today that matter, energy, space, time is a package deal. You can't have one without the other. Now, if time always existed and time is eternal, then there is an eternal number of years going back in the past. Would you grant that?
Yeah, this is the infinite regress problem. But I don't. The reason why I don't want to get into this minutia is because what will happen is I will say something like, well, there's some philosophers who say you can have an infinite regress, especially when you look at quantum theory, and then you're going to say, no, you can't, and I'm going to say, yes, they can, and back and forth we go. Um, let me ask you, if the universe is eternal, would that lower your confidence in a God?
Yeah, definitely. But again, there are just so many building blocks that go into my confidence. But yeah, I think there are many, many weighty theistic arguments.
Right, I understand, but I really appreciate your answer because I think there's a misconception on things like the Big Bang that that's the beginning of the universe in quotes, but it's the beginning of the expansion of our reality, of our universe. And a lot of physicists, like I highly recommend Sean Carroll. He was asked this question directly, like, does the universe need a beginning in order for our reality to make sense? And he'll just come out and flat out say, no, no, the beginning is not a requirement for our universe. And there's got the string theorists out there and everything, but I do see what you're saying, and I think a lot of theists, not just Christian, of all types, say that something can't come from nothing, therefore God, and that might be true. I'm not discounting that, but I just don't think there's any reason at this point, especially when it comes to cosmology, we're just beginning to understand the cosmos. Like, just the last 100 years is really when it's really taken off.
Okay, Doug, let me approach this a little differently. You pointed out correctly, and I admitted it, that I have a personal stake in there being a God. And definitely, I mean, God is everything to me, as I told you.
Yeah.
Do you have a personal stake in your agnosticism or atheism?
No. And I know that sounds very abrupt answer with, but
You're reading my mind.
but here's why I say that. My life would be easier if I could force myself to believe. I say that sincerely. I have a born again Christian wife who I'm sure has wept tears on many nights because her husband does not believe, who it just
Yeah,
wrenches her soul. I would have to be a cold hearted bastard to not care about that.
sure.
But I just can't force myself to believe. I think you can understand that, I hope.
I can, and I'm accepting what you're saying. But then on the other hand, I would just invite you to consider the possibility that there is we all carry around, I believe, an effective reason, maybe I should say an emotional reason, or a life commitments that also, along with other things, also underlie the things that we believe.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we can separate very easily the intellect from our motives. And I think maturity demands that we recognize these types of motives within ourselves. Now, again, you're not giving me any reason to believe that you have a deep-seated commitment to atheism. I'm just inviting you to consider that possibility.
Yeah, and let me be clear. What I think when people hear that phrase, deep-seated commitment to atheism, like I don't even know what that means. If you know what that means, let me know, because I've told you many times that I'm not committed to this, that miracles are not possible. A lot of atheists are. I'm not one of them. I often give the example of my sister who's completely paralyzed from MS. She's completely paralyzed except for her eyeballs and her mouth.
Wow.
Daniel, if you were to come into her hospital room and pray for her in the name of Jesus, and if she got up, started jumping, gained 50 pounds of muscle mass back, her neurons working again, my confidence in your God would go sky high. And I don't
Hmm.
need 100% certainty to believe. There's many things I don't have 100% certainty on that I currently believe. So I'm not going to be a hypocrite and change.
Yeah.
And so
Well.
that's that would remember I asked you what would change your mind to lower your
Hmm.
confidence. This
Hmm.
would Here's a specific example, and I've noticed a lot of people have been talking about Matt Dillahunty in the chat. Matt needs an example like this to tell theists like you
Now,
what
what
sincerely would change his mind, and that would change mine.
Now, what would you be amenable to many testimonies of people who were miraculously healed from incurable diseases?
Well, that's the thing with personal testimonies, right? It's personal, and so
Sure.
I know my sister, just like what you went through in your life. I
Hmm.
cannot really empathize with it unless I was you. And I know my sister's history. I know that this is not a trick. I know that she has MS. I've seen it. I've lived it. I've helped her in and out of her wheelchair. All these things. It's personal, right? And just like you had these personal experiences, I've heard so many amazing personal experiences from Christians.
Hmm.
Amazing. I'm being honest with you when I say this. I wish that would happen to me.
Hmm.
I would love that to happen to me, but it hasn't. And but even if it did, I would still leave myself a little bit of wiggle room of being wrong. Now, that doesn't mean I would be a non-believer, but I think doubt is a virtue, and that when someone says I know and I cannot be wrong ever, I've already done the research, Doug. I've already been through this. No, you can't change my mind now. Muslims say that, Hindus say that, Mormons say that, Scientologists say that. Very dangerous, in my opinion. It is, to me, humble and compassionate, can lead to compassion when one says, you know what? I've done all these things, but there's still a chance I'm wrong.
So, Doug, maybe consider the possibility that maybe you're committed to this idea that leaving room or skepticism is the highest attainment that a person can reach, and maybe that image represents for you something that gives your self-esteem something. You know, again. Again, there might be, a personal motive behind your not considering some of these alternative theories about the Gospels and leaving Christianity, and so maybe it's not a purely rational thing.
Well, you could be right. I might have motives that are leading me away from the truth, and you might have motives that are leading you away from the truth. So it gets back to one of the questions I asked you earlier. How do we work together as a team and forget about all our motivations, forget about all our biases? How do we suppress that and actually figure out what's true? And how do we live our lives in a way that we can say, I don't know, it might not be true, without all the negative stuff? Like I asked you the question, what would happen if your confidence was lowered or you stopped believing? And you said
Hmm.
you would go back to depression probably and panic attacks. That's a
Hmm.
huge motivation for you not to lower your confidence.
Well, sure it
And
is.
I understand that. I really do. But there might be let's say these doubts start creeping in, and that's a real fear in your mind that these panic attacks will come back. That doesn't mean there's not another way to solve that problem.
Oh, well, again, perhaps. And I was going to say something absolutely brilliant, but I forgot. Whenever I get the most brilliant thoughts, I forget. Darn.
Sorry about that.
And oh, that's okay. It probably wasn't that brilliant anyway. So,
well, we've been going like for an hour, close to an hour and a half. I don't know if you're tired or if you want to wrap it up, but I'm willing to give you the last word if you want it.
you know what? My mind has just gone blank. Maybe that is the best stance I could possibly take at this point. I don't know. But I really appreciate this opportunity and appreciated meeting you. And I'll be thinking about this. But even more than that, I'm going to be praying for your sister. Because I do believe now, I can't understand why God doesn't provide certain miracles and he does provide others. I don't understand that, but I will be praying for your sister.
Yeah, I've been doing interviews like this for at least 2 years, maybe closer to 3 now. Mm-hmm. And of course, my sister has family and friends who are all Christians, or mostly Christians, and they've been praying for years. Let me. Since you didn't have a last word to say, let me put one in here to kind of show you why I'm passionate about this.
Okay.
About why doubt's a virtue. When my sister went to church, she was told by her pastor that she was healed of MS. And I don't want to say that this necessarily definitively put her down a path of not seeking help. But it sure didn't contribute to her seeking the help that she needed. When people said to her, "How's your MS going, Rhonda?" she would reply, "I don't have MS anymore. I've been healed by Jesus."
Oh, well, that's sad.
Yeah.
That's irresponsible.
I know, but this is where my passion comes from. I was a Christian at this time, and and just to let you know, I left Christianity after the meat of all this happened, so that wasn't a part of it. But the reason why I'm passionate now about speaking out about doubt as a virtue, when I said to my sister, "You need to get help. You need to go to the MS Society in Canada and get the latest medications, and at least you can slow the progression down." You know what she said to me? "How dare you question my faith?"
Wow. Oh, gee. That troubles me. That's very troubling to me.
But she said what you said, Daniel. She said, I know that Jesus healed me. There's no chance I'm wrong, Doug. How dare you question and put these seeds of doubt into my head? This is why I think certainty is dangerous. And why I preach the gospel of doubt.
Are you certain about that?
No. There could be and here's why I say that. I've been asked that question many times before. I believe doubt is a virtue, but there could be ways. I had this great conversation. Well, I wouldn't maybe call it great, but I had a conversation with a Roman Catholic once, and he was talking about participatory knowledge and new ways of knowing. And one way of coming to knowledge is this participation in the supernatural, of submitting yourself to God, the God concept, and by faith walking with him. And you know what? He could be right. But I've tried that as well, and it seems like nothing's happened. But there might be ways of coming to knowledge that is different than, the so-called scientism. But so far, it hasn't worked for me, Daniel. And maybe someday it will. I don't know. But yeah, I nevertheless, I think doubt is still a virtue. It's still always to be humble enough to say, I could be wrong, and be open to new evidence, be willing to change, even though it might cost you dearly. I'm willing to go through that, Daniel. But this point in my life, so far, I just not convinced. My confidence is low. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. That makes sense.
I'm trying to fix my green screen. It's just messing up so badly. But I'm really glad that on short notice, like we were actually planning to do this on Tuesday, but short notice we just decided to go at it tonight, and I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too.
Yeah, I did too. A special opportunity.
And maybe we'll do it again sometime. I'm going on vacation soon, and so I won't be back till probably July. But maybe later on this summer, if you want to, we can both think about what we said to each other, and if there's something that we kind of missed, we can bring it up then.
Sounds good. I'd love the opportunity, and we're going to be going away too, probably for a good part of the summer. Our plans aren't in shape, but if you don't get a hold of me, it's not because I'm turning the cold shoulder. It's probably because we're away. We might be going out of the country. I'm not really sure right now.
Okay. But yeah, thanks again for a good civil dialogue. Even though we pushed each other, I think it was very cordial. Thank you to everyone in chat. You probably didn't even notice, but there's a whole bunch of people talking in chat, and there's been anywhere from...
Yeah, I see things. I can't read it, but I see things flashing on the screen there.
Yeah, there's been 20 to 40 people watching during this whole thing, and it seems like a lot of people enjoyed it as well. So thanks again.
Oh, very good, very good. And thank you, Doug.
Have a good night.
Appreciate it. Okay, you too. Okay, bye-bye.